The sun had begun its slow descent behind the jagged ridge of the plains, painting the sky in streaks of amber and blood red. The wind whispered through the tall grasses, carrying with it the earthy scent of sage and the distant smoke of a small campfire. He stood at the edge of the clearing, silent, his eyes tracing the horizon as if searching for something he couldn't name. The day had been long, filled with the labor of herding horses and mending fences, the kind of work that left muscles aching and thoughts wandering in quiet corners. Yet, something about the evening unsettled him. It wasn't the chill that had begun to creep into the air or the shadows stretching like fingers across the land, it was the presence of her. She emerged from the tree line with a calmness that felt both natural and deliberate. The late light caught in her hair, turning it to molten copper, and her eyes, dark, steady, and unflinching, seemed to hold a secret that no one else could read. He had seen her often in the village, a figure moving with purpose and grace, always present yet never entirely approachable. But tonight there was a softness to her step, a warmth that hinted at something more. Something he could neither name nor deny. "Do you want me?" she asked, her voice low, carrying over the wind without needing to raise it. It was a question that seemed simple enough, yet heavy with unspoken meaning. Her lips curled just slightly, not in a smile, but in a way that made his pulse hitch against his ribcage. The words hung in the air, fragile and fragile, as if daring him to break the silence that had grown thick between them. He did not answer at once. Silence was his language, his shield, and sometimes his confession. Words, he had learned, could be clumsy carriers of truth. But his eyes, dark and unreadable, lingered on her face, tracing the curve of her cheek, the way her shoulders moved beneath her worn yet carefully kept clothes, and the intensity of her gaze. She leaned closer, and the scent of earth and cedar clung to her, a grounding fragrance that seemed to anchor him to this single, suspended moment. It was not desire that held him in place, nor fear. It was recognition. Recognition of a force as wild and unpredictable as the land itself, of a connection older than any man-made boundary. They had danced around it before exchanges of glances. Small gestures, a word here, a glance there, but never had it been named aloud, and never had it been this raw, this immediate. And now, with her asking, he felt the weight of choices he had avoided all his life pressing down upon him. The firelight flickered across the clearing, casting them both in half shadow, half gold. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk called, and the sound cut through the quiet like a knife, reminding him that the world beyond this moment continued to turn. And yet, here they were, two figures on the brink of something that could not be undone, each waiting, each testing, each daring the other to step across an invisible line. He finally spoke, though not in words. A slight tilt of the head, a shift of the shoulders, a tightened grip on the reins of his horse-all gestures more revealing than speech could ever be. She noticed, and the faintest trace of a smile passed over her face. Not a smile of triumph or seduction, but of acknowledgment, of understanding. She had posed the question, and he had answered without breaking the rhythm of the moment. There was history between them, though it had never been fully named. He had watched her from a distance in the village square, noting how she moved among the children, how she handled the elders with quiet respect, how her laughter could lift the weight of a room. And she had seen him too, perhaps with the same intensity, perhaps with the same curiosity. In a land where silence often spoke louder than any spoken word, they had communicated in glances and gestures and fleeting moments that carried the heft of entire conversations. The wind shifted, carrying with it a scent of rain from the distant hills. Dark clouds had begun to gather on the horizon, and the first rumbles of a storm echoed faintly, promising both danger and cleansing. He felt the pull of the coming night, the certainty that life would soon demand decisions that could not be postponed. Yet here, in this moment, the world had narrowed to just the two of them, and the question she had asked lingered like the last note of a song, vibrating through his chest. Her hand hovered near his arm, not touching, but close enough to make the space between them electric. There was a courage in her posture, a willingness to risk rejection, a readiness to face whatever truth lay in his silence. He studied her, memorizing the line of her jaw, the depth of her eyes, the gentle flare of her nostrils. She was a storm contained in human form, and he was both drawn to it and wary of it. knowing that some forces, once unleashed, could not be restrained. The animals in the distance had grown restless, and the first drops of rain began to fall, dotting the earth and the leaves with tiny splashes. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable, and the storm seemed to echo the unspoken storm between them. One false move, one word, and the fragile balance could shatter. Yet the pull remained, undeniable, a tether that neither could resist. Finally, she spoke again, softer this time, a whisper almost swallowed by the wind. "You don't have to say anything." "I understand." It was a concession, yes, but also a challenge. Her eyes searched his, probing for a truth that he might not even know himself. And in that look he glimpsed the possibility of something rare, something deep and enduring, but also the danger of hearts unguarded, of trust untested. He remained still, the silence stretching, wrapping around them both like a living thing. Somewhere beyond the trees, lightning flickered, illuminating the world in stark, white bursts. And for a moment, in that fleeting brightness, he saw the potential of everything that might follow: connection, love, risk, change, and the fragility of the moment before a choice must be made. The question lingered in the air, unanswered yet answered in its own way. "Do you want me?" It was more than desire. It was an invitation, a confrontation, a reckoning with a future neither of them could fully predict. And as the rain began to fall more steadily, soaking the earth and the tall grasses, he felt the weight of that question press against him, demanding an answer he was not yet ready to give. But even in his silence, something had shifted. The world around them seemed sharper, more immediate, alive in ways it hadn't been before. The storm, the firelight, the distant calls of animals, they all became part of the same moment, a moment that would echo in their lives long after the rain had passed and the night had fallen. And there they stood, two figures in the storm, suspended between fear and courage, between past and future, between silence and confession. Neither spoke, yet everything had been said. And as the first cracks of thunder rolled across the plains, the question remained unresolved, a promise of tension and possibility that would not be easily forgotten. The rain had thickened now, drumming steadily against the earth, soaking the tall grasses and darkening the soil beneath their feet. He stayed where he was, motionless, letting the water run down his coat, mingle with the dust and sweat of the day, and mask the tension coiling in his chest. She had stepped back slightly, though her eyes never left him, and the faint curl of her lips hinted that she understood more than he could say. It was in the way she breathed, steady yet measured, in the way the storm seemed to recognize her presence and slow its fury around her. There was a quiet command in her, a natural authority that he had always admired from afar, and now, standing in the storm, it felt unstoppable. He remembered the first time he had seen her clearly, not as a girl running through the village or as a distant figure on the trail, but as someone who carried her own world within her. That afternoon had been scorching, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the prairie. He had been riding past the river when he noticed her crouched near the bank, gathering wild herbs with care and precision. She had moved as if the river itself had taught her how to touch the plants without disturbing the earth, and when her eyes had met his, there was neither surprise nor shyness. There was only recognition, as though the land itself had introduced them, and he had felt something stir within him that he had not felt before, something older than himself, something familiar and fleeting all at once. Since that day their lives had been intertwined in quiet, unspoken ways. Sometimes their paths would cross at the edge of the village, sometimes in the forested hills where hunters and gatherers moved like ghosts among the trees. Their interactions were small, subtle, a hand brushing against another while passing baskets of goods, a shared glance over a fire, the silent understanding that words could not fully contain. But each encounter left a mark, an imprint of a connection neither dared to name, yet neither could ignore. Now, standing together in the storm, that connection had grown heavier, more immediate. The tension between them was not just about attraction or desire, it was about unspoken truths, the weight of their histories and the danger of futures neither could predict. He thought of the elders who had raised him, teaching him to respect the land, to honor silence, and to understand that some truths were carried not in words but in action and restraint. And he thought of her, shaped by her own experiences, resilient, steadfast, yet willing to ask the questions that most people left unspoken. There had always been stories in their village about bonds that went deeper than the body, about connections forged in understanding and trust, tested by time and circumstance. Those stories had been warnings as much as lessons, reminding the young to respect power, to recognize danger, and to know the weight of a decision before it was made. And now, as the rain fell and the storm rumbled across the plains, he felt that weight pressing against his chest. The question she had asked lingered like a shadow, not threatening, but impossible to ignore. She shifted, gathering a fold of her cloak around her shoulders. Her eyes caught his again, and he could see the flicker of curiosity and challenge within them. It was not a challenge of confrontation, but of patience, of understanding, of waiting to see whether he would rise to meet the moment. There was history there, 2 moments they had shared in silence that had tested both their courage and their hearts. The memory of a shared sunset, the hush of a snowy morning, the quiet of a trail walked side by side, all of it came rushing back, layered with the tension of the storm and the unspoken questions still hanging between them. The land around them seemed to recognize the gravity of their moment. Trees bent under the wind, the river swelled with the runoff of distant hills, and lightning traced jagged paths across the sky, illuminating the plains in fleeting white flashes. It was as if the earth itself was holding its breath, aware that something significant was unfolding in that quiet clearing. He felt it in his bones, in the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, in the way the rain soaked his clothes and yet left him strangely calm. This was more than a meeting of 2 people. It was a collision of histories, of choices, of paths long walked and yet unresolved. He remembered the stories of his own family, of ancestors who had walked these lands with certainty and strength, whose lives were marked by decisions that rippled through generations. Those stories had taught him resilience, patience, and the value of silence. And yet, here was a question posed by her, simple and direct, and it demanded something he was not sure he could give, not yet, not fully. The rain fell harder, dripping from his hair into his eyes, and he realized that the storm mirrored his own uncertainty. He was caught between what he knew, what he felt, and what he feared, and the space between the 3 was growing smaller with each passing heartbeat. She stepped closer again, careful, deliberate. "I don't need you to say anything," she murmured, voice low, threading through the wind and rain. "I just needed to ask." It was not a surrender, but a statement of truth, of vulnerability, of courage. The kind of courage that made him both respect and fear her. He had seen courage before, in the faces of hunters facing storms, in elders making hard choices, in children learning to trust the earth. But this was different. This courage was not against the land or the elements. It was against the unknown within themselves, against the uncharted territory of connection and trust. He shifted slightly, loosening the reins of his horse, letting the leather slip through his hands. His eyes never left hers. He thought of the long days spent tracking, of nights around the fire, of the quiet moments when only the land and the animals witnessed their presence. All those memories merged with the storm and the question, creating a tension that felt both sacred and dangerous. She was not just a woman before him. She was a force, a presence that challenged everything he had learned to hold inside. The first roll of distant thunder shook the clearing, and a flash of lightning illuminated the contours of their faces. For a brief moment he saw her not as a neighbor or familiar figure, but as someone elemental, someone carved from the same wind and soil that had shaped him. And in that moment, he understood that the question she had asked was not just about desire or choice, it was about acknowledgement, about recognizing a bond that could not be denied, even if the timing was uncertain. He looked at her, at the way the rain clung to her hair and clothes, the way her eyes held steady in the storm, the way she waited without demand, and he felt the weight of all the unspoken moments they had shared. The moments of laughter, of shared labor, of glances that had lingered too long. The moments when the land itself seemed to shift around them, holding its breath for what might come. And he realized that silence, though his refuge, could also be a language of truth if spoken with attention, with intention. The storm began to intensify, the wind whipping around them, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. Trees bent beneath its force, and the river's surface roiled with the promise of rain yet to come. Yet, within this chaos, within this rush of elements, there was a stillness between them, a tether invisible but undeniable. He felt it pull him closer, though he did not move, and he felt the weight of choices yet to be made pressing on his chest. She stepped back slightly, giving him space, but her eyes never wavered. The faintest smile touched her lips, not a smile of triumph, but of acknowledgement. She had asked the question. He had not answered in words, and yet something had shifted. The world had narrowed to the space between them, to the storm, to the unspoken acknowledgement of what might be. The first true crack of thunder rolled across the plains, shaking the ground beneath their feet, and a sheet of lightning split the sky. He felt the moment stretch, infinite and immediate at once. The question remained, unresolved, echoing across the plains and in the spaces between their hearts. And in that stretch of silence he knew that nothing could ever be the same. Not the land, not the village, not even themselves. They stood together in the rain, two figures suspended between past and future, between fear and trust, between silence and confession. And as the storm swept across the plains, as lightning traced jagged paths above and thunder shook the ground, the tension between them held firm, unbroken, a promise of what could come and a warning of what might be lost. Neither spoke, yet everything had been said. The world outside the clearing could wait. This moment was theirs, fleeting, precious, and unresolved. And so the rain fell, the storm raged, and the question lingered, unanswered but alive, ready to shape the days to come. The storm had begun to ease, though the clouds still hung low and heavy over the plains. Drops of rain fell intermittently, wetting the earth and leaving behind the sharp scent of mud and pine. He rode slowly along the familiar trail back to the village, his thoughts tangled in the moments with her. Her question, simple and direct, had planted a seed he could not pull out, a knot of uncertainty and desire that refused to be untangled. Each step of the horse seemed to echo that unspoken tension, the rhythm of hooves striking the soft ground, a reminder that life would move forward whether he was ready or not. The village lay ahead, clustered along the bend of the river, smoke curling from chimneys and the soft glow of fires reflecting off wet rooftops. Life continued here, in small steady ways, but beneath the surface, currents ran deeper than the river itself. There were whispers about the land, about old disputes between families, about boundaries that had been tested in years past. He had learned to watch and listen, to understand the unspoken rules that guided them all. And now, the question she had asked hung over him, tangled with these old currents, making him feel as if he were balancing on the edge of a cliff. Inside the longhouse, the warmth of the fire welcomed him, but it did little to settle the storm still raging in his mind. Children ran past, their laughter mingling with the crackle of the flames, and elders spoke in low tones, voices heavy with stories and warnings. He nodded to familiar faces, offering a polite smile, yet his attention kept drifting to the thought of her. The woman who had asked the question that had shifted everything. He knew she had returned to her own dwelling, perhaps thinking of him as much as he thought of her, perhaps letting the rain wash away the hesitation that had clung to her like a second skin. There were more pressing matters than his own heart, though matters that tugged at the edges of his attention with equal weight. The plains had been restless, the herd skittish, and rumors had reached the village of strangers riding along the western ridge. Traders, they said, but there were always questions with strangers' questions that did not belong to anyone but the land itself. He had seen the trail earlier, faint marks pressed into the mud, patterns that told of haste and purpose. Something was coming, something he could not yet name, and it weighed alongside the tension with her, creating a storm inside his chest that mirrored the one outside. She too had her own burdens. The village saw her as strong and capable, but few understood the battles she carried silently. There were expectations she had grown into, roles that had been carved by tradition and necessity, and a past that shadowed her steps even now. Some of the elders regarded her with suspicion, wary of her independence and the strength in her gaze. Others watched her with quiet admiration, recognizing a spirit that could guide or challenge the future. And in all of this, the question she had posed to him was not just about desire, it was about trust, recognition, and the possibility of change in a world bound by old ways. He remembered her tending the sick child of a traveling family, her hands steady even when the child cried, her voice gentle yet firm. He remembered seeing her negotiate with traders, her words precise, her tone commanding respect. And he remembered the evenings they had spent near the river, exchanging glances, sharing a word here or there. Moments that felt private, though the world might have claimed them as ordinary. Those memories now collided with the present, adding layers of complication to the storm in his mind. Outside, the rain had slowed, leaving the air thick and damp. He thought of the plains, of the land he had walked since childhood, and of the choices that had shaped him. He had always believed in endurance, in patience, in understanding that some truths could not be rushed. Yet her question had forced a confrontation with the immediate, a reckoning with feelings and possibilities he had long kept at bay. And while he tried to focus on the practical, on the herds, the village, the signs of strangers approaching, he knew the personal could not be ignored. Not now, not ever. Meanwhile, she had not returned to the riverbank after the storm. She had taken her own path, moving along trails he knew only slightly, and he imagined her navigating the wet grasses, the uneven earth, the silent call of the land itself. He pictured her stopping to check the horizon, her hair wet and clinging, her eyes sharp and alert. Perhaps she too felt the stir of something larger than the question she had asked, the stir of currents beyond the village, beyond the plains, beyond the ordinary rhythms of daily life. The village had its own tensions, small and large. Families argued over land boundaries, disputes that had lasted generations. Traders moved through with goods and stories, stirring curiosity and suspicion alike. Children tested limits, elders reminded them of history, and the wind carried news and rumors like leaves along the river. In this mix, the personal and the political, the heart and the land intertwined with unpredictable consequences. His place in it and hers had shifted with one simple question, and neither could ignore the ripples it sent through the village's quiet surface. Night fell fully, leaving the village under a canopy of dark clouds and soft moonlight. Fires burned in homes, offering warmth and light, while shadows moved between buildings, carrying whispers of secrets and intentions. He walked among the villagers, nodding and speaking briefly, but his mind remained with her, with the question she had asked, with the storm outside and the storm inside him. And in that quiet reflection, he realized that the world was moving toward change whether he wished it or not. Back at her dwelling, she prepared for the evening in her usual methodical way. There was a strength in her routine, a calm that belied the tension in the air. She moved with purpose, stacking firewood, checking supplies, maintaining the order that the world expected of her. Yet every so often her gaze drifted to the horizon, to the trails, to the dark shapes of trees swaying in the wind. Her thoughts returned to him, to the way he had held himself in the storm, to the silence that had spoken louder than any words could. She wondered if he understood the full weight of her question, if he recognized how it had shifted the ground beneath them both. The village itself seemed aware of the approaching challenges. Small groups spoke in hushed tones about distant sightings, the stirrings of animals, the behavior of the land itself. They spoke of old stories, of ancestors who had navigated similar storms, of choices that had brought both prosperity and peril. And in the quiet of the night, beneath the soft glow of fires and the flicker of lamps, he realized that her question was not the only storm to face. There were layers of tension, threads of uncertainty and danger, woven through the land, through the village, and through the hearts of those who called it home. He stepped outside into the cool night air, listening to the distant call of an owl and the soft rustle of leaves. The sky was clearer now, though still heavy with clouds, and the stars glimmered faintly above. Somewhere beyond the village, movement caught his eye shapes in the shadows, figures on the ridges. His hand instinctively went to the bow at his side, alert, ready. He knew that the land held its own dangers, that threats could appear quietly and unexpectedly, and that he would need every ounce of focus to protect what mattered. And yet, even with the threat pressing close, the memory of her question remained at the center of his thoughts, pulling him in directions he could not ignore. The night deepened, carrying both quiet and unease. Somewhere along the river, a lantern swayed, perhaps a trader making their way home, perhaps someone testing the village's boundaries. He kept his gaze steady, mind alert, body ready, but heart unsteady. There were risks he could manage, dangers he could face, but there was no preparation for the tension she had awakened, the challenge she had laid bare with her single question. And he knew that before the night was through, both the personal and the practical would demand reckoning. In the distance, the faintest glimmer of firelight flickered against the trees, signaling movement, presence, or perhaps an unknown observer. He felt the weight of choice pressing down again, the same pressure that had come with her question, amplified now by the potential of unseen threats. He realized that life on the plains had always been a balance between patience and action, between silence and speaking, between heart and duty. And tonight, those balances were shifting, pulling him in directions that were at once familiar and terrifyingly unknown. Even in the quiet moments, the tension remained. He thought of her, of the strength in her gaze, the courage in her words, the way she had leaned closer in the storm and asked him the question that would not leave him. And he knew, with certainty, that the days ahead would demand more than silent reflection. They would demand decisions, tests of trust, and the courage to face both the known and the unknown. And so the village slept under a canopy of stars and clouds, unaware of the currents shifting in the hearts of two people and of the stirrings beyond the ridge. The question lingered, unresolved, as both waited for the dawn and for the storms both of weather and of the heart that were yet to come. The morning arrived quietly, though the land seemed unsettled, as if the plains themselves were aware that something was coming. Mist clung low to the river, curling around the roots of the trees and the edges of the fields. He stepped outside before the sun fully rose, feeling the chill on his skin, the weight of the night's unanswered questions pressing against him. The storm from the previous evening had left puddles and mud, making travel slow and deliberate. He rode along the familiar trails, senses sharpened, noting each subtle movement of birds, each ripple in the river, each shift in the wind. Something or someone moving through the edges of the village, and he knew instinctively that the peace of routine was about to be broken. She had been up before him, tending the fire and checking the supplies, preparing for the day as though nothing had changed, but he knew better. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, the way her eyes scanned the horizon, the quiet alertness in every motion. She had felt it too, the tension in the land, the currents of unease weaving through the village and through the people themselves. And somewhere in the mix of danger and vigilance, there was the unspoken tension between them, the question that still hovered, heavy and unresolved. The village was beginning to stir. Children ran toward the central square, laughter ringing in the morning air, and elders moved between houses, checking on neighbors and livestock. Traders had arrived early, their wagons creaking under the weight of goods, and the smell of baked bread and roasted meat drifted faintly across the damp fields. But beneath all of this, there was unease, subtle and persistent. There were tracks along the edges of the forest that did not belong to known hunters, footprints pressed into the mud that spoke of haste and unfamiliar intent. Whispers passed from one villager to another, questions framed carefully, eyes darting to the ridges and distant hills. He rode through the village slowly, nodding and offering greetings, but his attention remained fixed on the outskirts. He noticed a group of figures moving along the western ridge, shadows against the mist, and felt a familiar knot of tension tighten in his chest. They were too cautious to be casual travelers, too deliberate to be harmless. Something was approaching, something that would test the village and everyone in it, and he realized that he could not ignore the threat. Yet even as his mind focused on strategy, on preparation, on the practicalities of defense, part of him remained tied to her, to the storm of emotion and unspoken desire that had begun with one simple question. She joined him as he rode toward the ridge, silent but steady, her eyes sharp as they scanned the horizon. He noted the confidence in her movements, the way she instinctively assessed danger, weighing each shadow and sound. Her presence was a comfort and a challenge, a reminder that some strengths were shared, that courage could be multiplied when acknowledged and trusted. And yet her gaze carried something more: expectation, curiosity, and a quiet insistence that he confront what he had left unspoken. The strangers came closer, their horses moving through the mist with deliberate caution, and the villagers began to notice the movement. Some ran to alert the elders, while others prepared defensive positions near the stock and dwellings. He felt the tension in the air, thick and almost tangible, as if the wind carried the anxiety of every living thing. And in that moment, he realized that the question she had asked was not just a personal test, it was part of a larger truth. To act, to trust, to acknowledge connection and strength was as essential as defending the village itself. The first encounter was sudden. A horse neighed sharply from the ridge, and one of the strangers broke from the group, moving toward the village center with urgent speed. He rode to meet the figure, signaling her to stay close, their horses cutting a path through the mist and mud. The stranger's eyes were wide with desperation, and his voice carried a warning. The ridge was not safe. Others were following, and the village itself could be in danger. He processed the words quickly, noting the tone, the urgency, the subtle clues that revealed more than was said aloud. They moved together through the village, coordinating silently with the elders and the hunters, preparing the people for what might come. The storm of emotion between them, the question, the silence, the acknowledgement of what could remain beneath the surface, unspoken but present. It fueled their movements, sharpened their focus, and added a layer of urgency that made every decision heavier, more consequential. Every glance exchanged, every gesture carried weight, and the villagers sensed the electricity of anticipation in the air. The sun finally broke through the clouds, casting pale light across the plains, and for a brief moment the world seemed still, but it was only a pause. The strangers had moved into view fully, revealing riders in dark clothing and unfamiliar gear, their intent unreadable yet unmistakably deliberate. The village prepared quietly, some moving to secure stock, others readying weapons or positioning themselves behind barricades. And he, standing with her at the edge of the central square, felt the tension coil tighter than ever, a rope pulled taut between anticipation and action. She leaned slightly closer, her voice low, almost lost in the morning breeze. "We have to act, together." The words were simple, yet carried authority and challenge. He nodded, and in that single motion acknowledged not only the danger approaching the village, but also the connection between them, the trust they had begun to forge in silence and storm. There was no time for hesitation, no room for doubt. The day demanded clarity of purpose, and yet beneath it all, the question remained alive, shaping the courage they would need to face what was coming. The first clash came with subtlety, a test rather than full confrontation. One of the strangers attempted to bypass the main path, seeking advantage, and he intercepted quietly but firmly. She followed his lead, moving with precision, her hands steady, her eyes sharp. It was as if the storm of the night before had trained them both, had taught them how to respond to urgency without losing themselves in panic. The villagers watched, learning from every movement, feeling the tension rise and understanding that survival depended not only on strength but on unity, on trust, and on action guided by clear awareness. More figures approached from the ridge, and the air seemed charged with anticipation. Birds took flight in startled flocks, and the wind carried the scent of dust and wet grass. He and she stood side by side now, aware of every shadow, every step, every subtle movement in the periphery. Their connection, unspoken yet undeniable, lent them strength. Each knew the other's instincts, trusted them without words, and moved in silent coordination as they prepared to face what was coming. And still, the question lingered, an undercurrent beneath the practical concerns, shaping decisions and fueling courage. The situation escalated quickly. A group of strangers dismounted near the edge of the river, moving with intent, and the villagers readied themselves. Children were ushered indoors, elders gave instructions quietly but firmly, and hunters and warriors took positions where they could observe and respond. The tension in the air was palpable, the kind that made hearts pound, breaths catch, and the weight of every choice sharper than ever. And throughout it all, he felt her presence beside him, a tether that reminded him that courage and clarity were strongest when shared. A sudden flash of movement drew their attention. One of the strangers had tried to flank the village, and he moved swiftly to intercept, signaling her to follow. They raced across the open field, the ground slick beneath the horses' hooves, mud spraying with each stride. Every second felt stretched, every heartbeat amplified, and yet even in the rush, he felt the pull of the question, of the bond that had begun between them, waiting to be acknowledged in a moment when the storm of life and danger demanded action. The villagers' murmurs rose, a mixture of fear and determination as the confrontation approached. He caught glimpses of familiar faces, each reflecting the same mix of uncertainty and resolve, and knew that the day would test everyone in ways unforeseen. Yet even as the practical dangers pressed close, the undercurrent of personal tension remained, guiding his choices, shaping his reactions, and reminding him that some battles were fought not only with strength, but with trust, understanding, and courage born from connection. Lightning split the sky briefly, illuminating the field, the river, and the approaching strangers. The moment stretched, frozen in clarity and anticipation. He and she stood ready, side by side, hearts racing, eyes fixed, waiting for the moment when everything would collide. And in that pause, in that breath held between action and consequence, the storm of tension reached its peak. Every decision, every instinct, every silent word exchanged between them carried the weight of what was coming. The day, the threat, and the question she had asked all converged, building to a moment where choices would matter more than words. The air was thick with anticipation, the land itself seeming to hold its breath, and the villagers prepared for the clash that would define the hours ahead. And though the outcome was still uncertain, though danger pressed close and every heartbeat carried the weight of the unknown, one thing was undeniable. The connection between them, forged in storm and silence, would shape what was to come. The moment teetered on the edge of action, ready to fall into chaos or clarity, and the plains waited. Silent witnesses to the tension that had grown from a question asked, a silence kept, and a bond yet fully realized. The tension that had gripped the village for hours finally broke with the first clear cry from the defenders. The strangers halted at the edge of the field, surprised by the unity and resolve of the people before them. Horses stamped impatiently, and the wind carried the scent of damp earth and fire, mixing into a heady tension that made every heartbeat sharper. He rode forward, the reins firm in his hands, and she was at his side, their movements synchronized as though the storm and silence of past days had trained them for this precise moment. One of the strangers faltered, realizing that they were not merely facing a handful of villagers, but a community bound by trust and familiarity, by strength shared and knowledge of the land. He and she exchanged a brief glance, acknowledging silently the courage it had taken to arrive at this moment, and in that glance, a tension that had lingered for days, for weeks, for months, began to ease. Not completely, for some questions could only be answered through action, but enough to allow a moment of clarity amidst the chaos. The confrontation did not explode into full violence, but it did not need to. The strangers, weighing the determination before them, backed down in cautious retreat. He followed their movements carefully, making sure none would circle back or attempt a trap, while she organized villagers to secure the perimeter and tend to the stock. The villagers moved as one, calm and alert, their eyes carrying the wisdom of generations that had faced danger and survived. And somewhere in the midst of it, he realized that the storm had passed not only over the land, but also within himself. She approached him then, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of relief and something more tender. The question she had asked lingered still, but now it carried weightless possibility instead of tension. "The village is safe," she said softly, her voice carrying over the field, steady and confident. He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat, and for the first time, he felt the courage to respond not only to the threat outside, but to the unspoken truths between them. The villagers began to settle back into their routines, the laughter of children returning to the square, the smell of cooking fires drifting again across the fields, and the elders shaking heads but smiling faintly at the resilience displayed. Life was returning to its rhythm, though it had been forever marked by the morning's events. And through it all the bond between him and her had grown, forged in danger, strengthened by trust, and tempered by silence that had finally been acknowledged. He watched her move among the villagers, checking on the injured, speaking softly to those who were shaken, offering quiet words of reassurance. There was a strength in her presence, a calm authority that did not demand attention, but earned it, and he felt a sense of awe that went beyond admiration. He had known courage before, had seen it in elders and hunters, in storms weathered and choices made. But hers was different. It was personal, immediate, and tied directly to the trust she inspired. When the last of the strangers had vanished beyond the ridge, the tension finally released fully. The villagers began tending to their homes and herds, laughter slowly returning and the air carrying a sense of relief that was almost tangible. He rode toward the river, she walking at his side, the grass wet beneath her boots, the water reflecting the pale light of afternoon. And for the first time, he felt that the question she had asked could finally be addressed, not in fear or hesitation, but in acknowledgement of what had grown quietly between them. They paused at the edge of the riverbank, the water calm and clear, rippling gently in the breeze. She looked at him, her eyes steady and inviting, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow, returning to only the two of them and the quiet land around them. The weight of words, of silences, of all the small gestures that had carried meaning for months, pressed gently between them. And he realized that desire, trust, courage, and connection could coexist, that the question she had asked was not a challenge but an invitation, one that he was finally ready to accept. "I do," he said simply, voice low but certain, the words carrying all the acknowledgement and honesty he had withheld before. Her hand brushed against his arm, a fleeting touch that held more than a promise. It held recognition, understanding, and the possibility of what lay ahead. There was no need for further words. The tension that had bound them so tightly was transformed into something solid, dependable, and real. The villagers noticed the change too, in small ways. Elders nodded approvingly at quiet glances exchanged between them. Children ran past, sensing the calm but electric energy of connection. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of earth and pine, the sound of the river and the gentle creak of horses returning to their grazing. Life continued, but it had shifted subtly, colored now by the acknowledgement of trust and heart that had been tested and proven. Over the next hours they moved through the village together, helping neighbors, repairing fences, checking the livestock, sharing words with those who had been frightened, and laughing softly as they noticed the small recoveries of life returning to normal. The work was ordinary, but in that ordinariness there was extraordinary proof of resilience, courage, and connection. And each shared glance, each small touch, strengthened the bond that had begun with a single question asked in the storm. Evening approached, and the sky burned with the rich colors of sunset, casting amber and rose across the plains. They returned to the clearing near the river, where the storm had first drawn them together, and stood side by side watching the horizon. The events of the day, the threat, the tension, the fears and courage had resolved not through chaos but through presence, trust, and understanding. And beneath it all there was a quiet acknowledgement that what had begun in storm and question had grown into a bond strong enough to withstand both the land and life itself. She leaned slightly closer, resting a hand lightly against his, and he felt a calm he had not known for months. "We faced the storm," she said softly, voice carrying warmth and certainty. "And it brought us here," he nodded, realizing that the simple truths of courage, trust, and connection were sometimes more powerful than words, and that the land itself had borne witness to all of it. The plains, the river, the village, they had all held their breath and watched, and now life flowed forward with a quiet but undeniable rhythm. Night fell gently, stars appearing over the ridge and reflecting in the calm river, and the village settled into peace. Fires burned softly in the longhouses, the wind carried the scent of cooking, and laughter drifted from the square as the day's tensions faded into memory. He and she walked together through the fields, the grass damp beneath their boots, hands brushing, hearts lighter, and minds at rest. The question that had once caused hesitation now held promise. The silence that had spoken so loudly now transformed into shared understanding, and the tension that had bound them was finally at peace. They paused at the edge of the river, looking out over the water as moonlight glimmered on the surface. For the first time, there was no fear, no doubt, only recognition of all they had endured together and all that might come. He realized that life on the plains would always hold uncertainty, that storms and challenges would return, but that connection, trust, and courage could withstand any force if nurtured and honored. She turned to him, and without words they understood the depth of the bond they had forged, tested, proven, and unbreakable. In the quiet of the night, with the river flowing gently, the stars shining above, And the village safe and thriving, they walked back toward the longhouse together. The land around them was calm, yet alive, carrying the echoes of the day's events and offering the promise of all the days yet to come. They had faced danger, uncertainty, and the questions that life demanded, and they had emerged not only intact but strengthened, their connection deeper than either had imagined. And in that moment he understood what her question had truly asked, not only about desire, but about courage, trust, and the willingness to step forward into the unknown with someone beside you. He had answered not only for himself, but for the life they could build together, rooted in honesty, respect, and quiet strength. The plains stretched before them, vast and alive, a reminder that life continued, but also that connection and courage could make even the wildest spaces feel like home. They entered the longhouse together, the warmth of the fire welcoming them, the smells of evening cooking, the soft chatter of neighbors. For the first time in days he felt truly at peace, knowing that while challenges would always arise, the bonds of trust, courage, and understanding they had forged would endure. And as they settled beside the fire, hands brushing, hearts aligned, he realized that the question asked in the storm had changed everything, opening the way to a life shared, a bond acknowledged, and a future that held promise across the plains and beyond. The village slept under a calm sky, the river reflecting the silver light of the moon, and the plains were quiet, as if granting permission for rest, for reflection, and for new beginnings. He and she remained together, side by side, watching the night and feeling the strength of connection, the relief of tension resolved, and the quiet thrill of lives now intertwined. The storm had passed, the conflict had been met, and the bond that had begun in silence and question had blossomed into something enduring, true, and steady. And so, the plains held their breath no longer. Life moved forward, tempered by courage, guided by trust, and marked by the quiet strength of hearts that had faced both danger and desire, finding in each other the calm, the understanding, and the love that would carry them into all the days yet to come.